Welcome to another video exploring the folk horror universe. Folk horror is often treated like a vintage haunt, something we associate with grainy 1970s films, eerie British villages, and old gods waking up under a harvest moon. But the truth is, folk horror never went away. It simply changed clothes. Modern folk horror is thriving because it speaks to the anxieties we live with right now: isolation, mistrust, climate dread, social fracture, the slow collapse of what once felt stable. It's a genre that understands a chilling truth. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't a monster at all. It's a community, a tradition, a landscape that remembers you. And modern authors have taken the folk horror toolkit: ritual, superstition, rural dread, pagan echoes, the old world pushing up through the floorboards, and used it to explore everything from grief and trauma to class tension, environmental fear, and the way the past can colonize the present. So today, let's take a walk through the shadows of contemporary folk horror and meet a few of the writers who are keeping the bonfire lit. At its heart, folk horror is a story about place. Not just setting, place as identity, place as history, place as trap. In folk horror, the countryside is rarely comforting. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also watchful. The forest isn't just trees. The moor isn't just open land. The village isn't quaint. It is a closed system with rules, spoken and unspoken, and newcomers tend to learn them the hard way. Modern folk horror leans into that. It often begins with someone returning to an old home, inheriting a property, moving to a remote place for peace, or trying to escape the city. And then the story quietly asks, what makes you think you're welcome here? One of the most recognizable names in modern folk horror is Adam Nevill, a writer who understands how to turn a landscape into a predator. In Neville's work, nature is not pastoral. It is hungry. It is ancient. It is indifferent to your plans, your logic, your confidence. His stories often feature characters who believe they can rough it, hike it, camp it, conquer it, only to discover that the wild isn't a backdrop for their personal growth. It's the mouth of something old. Neville's folk horror frequently plays with the idea of the unseen presence, something you glimpse in the corner of the eye, something implied by signs and symbols, something that doesn't need to be explained to feel real. And that's one of modern folk horror's greatest strengths. It lets implication do the heavy lifting. Because when you explain the god, you shrink it. When you name it, you give the reader a handle. Folk horror prefers to keep the thing faceless behind the trees. Another modern master of folk horror's quiet dread is Michael Hurley. Hurley's stories are often slow-burning, steeped in atmosphere, and tangled in the kind of rural religious intensity that feels like a spell. His settings are damp, isolated, and almost timeless, places where modern life seems far away, and people still live by old rhythms, old resentments, and old faith. Hurley's particular magic is that he makes the supernatural feel possible without ever fully stepping into fantasy. His horror is often ambiguous in the best way. You're never quite sure whether you're witnessing something genuinely otherworldly or watching human beings create horror out of belief, fear, and desperation. And that's a key modern folk horror theme: belief as a force. Not belief as comfort, belief as weapon. Then there's Alison Littlewood, who often writes folk horror with a sharp emotional edge, stories where the supernatural is less monster of the week and more like a psychological bruise that won't heal. Littlewood's work frequently explores family, memory, and the way small communities can suffocate you while smiling warmly to your face. There's an intimacy to her horror, an understanding that folk horror doesn't need a maypole and a sacrifice to be terrifying. Sometimes folk horror is a mother who won't talk about what happened in the village. Sometimes it's a childhood friend who remembers you differently than you remember yourself. Sometimes it's the feeling that the place where you grew up has kept a piece of you and doesn't intend to give it back. Modern folk horror also increasingly intersects with social horror, exploring the realities of class, poverty, neglect, and the way certain places are abandoned. Economically, politically, culturally, until what remains is a kind of quiet pressure cooker. That's where writers like Sarah Moss come into the conversation, authors who are less interested in pagan spectacle and more interested in the slow human dread of isolation, environment, and survival. In these stories, folk horror becomes a mirror for modern life. The fear of being cut off, the fear of the wilderness, the fear of weather, the fear of your own mind when there's nobody around to interrupt it. And importantly, modern folk horror often asks, what happens when you remove the illusion of safety? Because city life gives us systems, streetlights, neighbours, police, hospitals, Wi-Fi. The fantasy that help is always one phone call away. Folk horror says, not here. A fascinating shift in contemporary folk horror is the way it blends with eco-horror, stories where the natural world isn't just eerie, but actively responding to what humans have done to it. Old folk tales often framed nature as enchanted, forests that whisper, rivers that remember, hills with names and moods. Modern folk horror sometimes frames nature as retaliatory or simply fed up. You see stories where the land becomes hostile not because it's evil, but because it's been exploited, poisoned, stripped, and ignored. In this version of folk horror, the old gods can be interpreted many ways. Literal ancient beings, or metaphors for the truth we refuse to face. That the earth is not infinite, that there are consequences, and that we are not, in fact, in control. Modern folk horror also loves the idea of the outsider, and it plays with it in smarter ways than older stories sometimes did. The outsider might be a tourist, a skeptic, a city transplant, a journalist, an academic, a hiker, a missing person investigator. But the outsider can also be someone who should belong, someone born there, who returns and discovers they no longer fit the shape the community demands. And communities in folk horror are often terrifying because they don't behave like individuals. They behave like organisms. They protect themselves, they police boundaries, they reward conformity, they punish curiosity, they remember everything. And they never forget who you used to be. This is where modern folk horror becomes especially potent for readers today because it taps into a very real contemporary fear, social fracture. We live in a time of mistrust, of institutions, of government, of neighbours, of media, of everything. Folk horror weaponizes that mistrust by putting you in a place where everyone knows something you don't. And they're not going to tell you. The kindly shopkeeper, the priest, the neighbour who offers you pie, the pub full of locals who go quiet when you walk in. Modern authors understand the power of that moment. Because it isn't just creepy, it's human. And it triggers something ancient in us, the fear of being outnumbered. Some modern folk horror leans toward the cosy. Yes, even folk horror can be cosy in its own dark way, especially when it mixes folklore with humour, warmth, and sharp character work. A great example of a writer who sometimes brushes the folk horror edge, especially when working with fairy tale logic and rural menace, is T. Kingfisher. In stories like these, the world feels slightly skewed, as if the old folklore rules are still in effect, and you might survive, but you won't walk away unchanged. That's the thread that connects so many modern folk horror stories: transformation. Folk horror is rarely about defeating the evil and returning to normal. It's about the way horror remakes you. And of course, modern folk horror has been strongly shaped by authors like Shirley Jackson, who isn't modern in the newest sense, but whose influence is everywhere. Jackson taught horror writers that the most chilling ritual doesn't require candles and chanting. It requires people who believe they're doing the right thing. A stone in the hand. A rule everybody follows. A smile, a shrug, a tradition that's always been done. So many modern authors carry that lesson forward, crafting stories where the ritual isn't just theatrical, it's ordinary. That ordinariness is what makes it terrifying. And if you haven't read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, well, you should. So what do modern folk horror authors give us exactly? They give us the old fears, updated. They give us haunted landscapes, but also haunted histories. They give us pagan echoes, but also social critique. They give us rituals, but also the horror of conformity. They give us the old gods, but also the dread of ecological collapse. They give us villages that feel like traps, but also families, institutions, and systems that demand silence. Modern folk horror is not nostalgia. It's a living genre. And in a world that feels increasingly unstable, folk horror thrives because it answers a question we're all quietly asking. What happens when the rules stop protecting us? And perhaps that's why folk horror continues to evolve. Because it isn't really about the past. It's about the parts of the past that refuse to stay buried. The old beliefs we pretend we've outgrown. The violence hidden inside tradition. The wilderness at the edge of town. The history under the church floor. The story your grandmother wouldn't tell you. The one you only learn when you're grown, and it's too late to unlearn it. So if you've been craving horror that feels earthy, atmospheric, and quietly devastating, if you want stories where the wind sounds like a warning and the trees feel like witnesses, modern folk horror has plenty waiting for you. Just remember, when you step off the main road, when the signal dies, when the locals smile a little too long, that's not the beginning of peace and quiet. That's the beginning of the story. And the land has been expecting you. Please like and subscribe for more folk horror and folk magic videos. And check out my books on Amazon. Be seeing you.